Okay, so here we return to part 2 of our discussion of the nature of emotion. We've already talked about what an emotion is, its different components, and we're going to turn now to the second part, what causes those emotions. I will say that you should already have read this relevant section in your textbook talking about the biological perspective and the cognitive perspective on emotions, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. I'm just going to sort of mention it and refer you to your book. The biological perspective has a number of different theories and approaches, but if you want to put it in the very smallest possible nutshell, they all boil down to behavior causes emotion. Right? We typically think about emotion causing behavior. I am excited and so I go and give a hug to my sister. Or I am angry, so I smack my little brother upside the head because he chucked my puzzle, right? We think about emotion causing behavior. But this really surprising idea that was put forth in the toward the end of the 20th century, the 19th century into the early 20th century, is the idea that behavior causes emotion and not necessarily the other way around. So the pictures that I have over here, this is William James, the sort of father of American psychology, and Carl Lang. They were two different psychologists who actually worked independently and came up with relatively similar theories. So their theories have been put together nowadays into what's called the James-Lang theory. Other famous people in this area are folks who made the Cannon-Bard theory. They are named cleverly Cannon and Bard. But the basic gist of this whole perspective is, first, when you encounter an emotionally significant life experience, the first thing you do is you have an automatic physiological response. This might be an increased heart rate, muscle tension, an immediate behavioral response. You have this physiological response first. After that, a short period later in time, you then try to make sense of that physiological response, and then you attribute an emotion, such as fear. So you'd say first, oh, hey, look, I'm making, a face with my eyes really big and my mouth open and turned down, and I'm starting to shake. Oh, I wonder if I might be afraid. Right? I know this is sort of a dorky way to talk through this, and that's obviously in real life it happens much, much quicker than that. But that's essentially what we're talking about. So that's the James-Lang theory. Cannon-Bard is a little bit different. It states that physiological and cerebral effects happen simultaneously, rather than physiological first and cerebral second. So you don't have to know the details of them, but just be familiar with those two general ideas about behavior causes emotion rather than the other way around. These days, there's a little bit more empirical research support for the Cannon-Bard theory than for James-Lang. But that said, really all I care about is that you're familiar with sort of what happens first, what happens second within this biological domain. The cognitive perspective, again, also includes a whole bunch of theories within it with their own, each one has research empirical evidence. One really well-known theory is the Schachter-Singer cognitive labeling theory. These pictures over here on the right are, there we go, Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer, who worked together to create this Schachter-Singer theory. Basically, all of the cognitive perspective theories boil down to the following. Your cognitive interpretations of what's happened cause both your emotion and your behavior. Let me say that again. Your cognitive interpretations of what's happened, those are the things that cause your emotions and your behavior. Remember, the biological perspective was your behavior causes your emotion. Behavior happens first, emotion happens second. Cognitive perspective says, nope, before any of that happens, you have a cognitive interpretation, what's going on, and then as a result of that, you have emotion, and as a result of that, you have behavior. So the way that this works, and sort of thinking about on a timeline, first you experience a physiological arousal, just like you did with the biological perspective, an increased heart rate, muscle tension, whatever. Second, you look for a cognitive label, some sort of idea that describes how you're feeling. I'm going to apply the label fear to this situation. Then, third, this cognitive label, hey, I'm afraid, produces both an emotional response and a behavioral response. right? So as a result of that, I then have all of these sort of motivational processes that we call emotion, and the behavioral response, I'm going to run away from this scary thing. So that's Schachter-Singer's cognitive labeling theory. There are other theories. Lazarus's appraisal theory your book talks about. There are a number of other ones. So again, like I said, I'm not going to go into great depth here, but the point is that the biological perspective says behavior first, emotion second. The cognitive perspective says cognitive interpretation first, emotion and behavior second. So let's think about how and whether we can actually put the biological and cognitive perspectives together. Because throughout much of the 20th century, theorists have been really battling and saying, oh no, the biological perspective is right. No, the cognitive perspective is right. And honestly, modern research suggests that probably both are correct in different ways or in different aspects. Like we probably do use both of these perspectives simultaneously. So let's imagine, let's kind of walk through what this might actually look like. So you have a significant life event that causes a distinct pattern of brain activity. Now, of course, depending on what the emotion is or what the life event is, you're going to have different patterns of brain activity. Right? So the biological system, it's innate, spontaneous, it reacts involuntarily. You're walking along in the woods and you see something out of the corner of your eye that's long and slithery, right? So like that's going to activate particular neurons to fire in a particular way, right? And so then you might have a cognitive system, a more contemporary system that's more deliberate, it's slower acting, and it activates at some point after this biological system, and then you go, okay, what am I going to do about this? Right? Is it going to heighten or decrease my initial response? Oh my gosh, it's a snake, get out of here! Ah! Right? If you are, a herpetologist, and you really like snakes, you probably, that cognitive process is going to take down your fear, and you're going to be like, oh cool, it's a double diamond slithery razorback snake. I know zero about snakes, as you can probably tell. So this idea is we have the biological piece causing cognitive processes and also particular distinct bodily reactions, right? So you have an immediate sort of affect, that's the brain activity. You have a cognitive response, what's going on here? You have a biological process, maybe that's your thumping heart, your flushed cheeks, your increased heart rate, whatever the case might be. And then those two things together, cognitive and biological processes together, are what drive the four pieces of emotion that we saw previously, right? Your affect, your bodily response, your sense of purpose, your expressive behaviors. Right, so it's not necessarily the case that the biological perspective is right and the cognitive perspective is wrong. It's more like they're probably both right. They probably both happen. They probably both influence us. It might be that the cognitive is more right in some circumstances. The biological is more right in other circumstances. I don't know. It's ongoing research. So I encourage you, let me give you an example. And I encourage you to pause the video and kind of work through the example given this diagram. So here's your example. The woman of your dreams has just asked you to marry her. She's funny, smart, friendly, honest, compassionate, and you are just totally in love with her. So I want you to work through this example, right? This person has proposed marriage to you, and think through the model that we just worked through, right? So what might happen in your brain, what are your cognitive processes, what happens biologically, and then how does that produce these four elements in the sort of white box on the right-hand side. Okay, moving on, after you've gone through that example, you probably said something like you have an immediate pleasant reaction, that's your affective response. You have a bodily response, that might be increased heart rate, maybe flush of the cheeks. You have a sense of purpose. You start looking forward to the wedding and you just really want to give her a hug and you're just so excited. You start planning what you're going to do for the wedding and for the rest of your life. you probably have some sort of expressive behavior, right? You have a big stupid grin on your face and you like start squealing and you're like, oh, this is so great and wonderful. I'm so excited, right? So that's, right, we can put all of these elements together. Another thing that's really interesting about how emotions work is through the interactions of these elements. And I kind of mentioned that previously when I talked about, right, how emotion affects affect, bodily responses, expressive behavior, sense of purpose, right? And there were all these arrows going between all of the elements in the diagram. Now, one thing that's really interesting is that there's, what do I want to say? These things influence each other forward in time in a multi-dimensional pattern. I don't know how clear that was, but the first thing that happens is there's a significant life event, and then a whole bunch of stuff happens in the middle, and then out spits an emotion. And that isn't to say that the emotion can't change or can't reciprocally influence these things in the middle of the feedback loop, right? But the point here is to get you thinking about how your physiological arousal might influence your cognition. How might that influence your overt behavioral activity? How might that influence your expressive displays, right? So like your emotion, your face smiling or frowning or whatever. Your immediate affect, your preparation for action, right? Sort of looking to the future. So again, these things all strongly influence each other in all sorts of crazy, multifaceted ways. Okay, so we've talked about what an emotion is. We've talked about biological and cognitive perspectives on emotions. Then the other thing I want to talk about today is the physical and situational factors that influence us to have different emotional experiences. So you might remember from a previous class, we talked about the idea of embodied cognition. So if you were here that day, remember that one half of the room I said, make your hands into a tight ball, clench your jaw. The other half I said, have a very open posture, right? Let your hands be palm up and let your face be sort of natural. And then I showed you a sort of dorky picture or a dorky video that was meant to be funny. And I asked, how funny do you find this video to be? That's actually kind of a blend of cognition and emotion. So it's your conscious evaluation of, that's something I could find amusing. That's a cognitive process, like consciously, cognitively thinking through this, I understand this is amusing, which sounds really, very stilted and robotic. But there's also the experience of actually enjoying or not enjoying the video. That's the emotional piece, right? So you could imagine a person who has brain damage, or a person who has autism, for instance, who sort of understands cognitively this should be funny, like I get the joke, but doesn't necessarily feel the emotional piece, like I don't feel connected to this. So we talked about the idea of embodied cognition, how your physical state, what you're doing with your fists and your jaw, influence how funny or not funny you find this video to be. So you might cognitively be like, I recognize this could be amusing, but what your body is doing influences whether or not you actually find it funny. It turns out we also have embodied emotion, right? We talked about embodied cognition. Here's embodied emotion. So there's really a bunch of super cool research on what's called the facial feedback hypothesis. It really burst onto the scene in the late 80s. There was a whole bunch of research on it in the 90s into the early 2000s. The basic idea of the facial feedback hypothesis is sort of the next step past what we've already talked about, what that demo was like previously in class. What these researchers did is they asked participants to take a pen and hold it in their mouth, either holding it with their teeth, as you see in the first picture here, or holding it with their lips, as you see in the second picture. The idea is, excuse me, the idea is that holding a pen between your teeth, the picture on the left, contracts the zygomaticus major muscle, which is a facial muscle that contracts when you smile, right? Like, take a second, you're going to feel like a dork, but do it anyway. Smile and think about how that physically feels. What muscles in your face are activating when you do that? Okay, so that's the zygomaticus major muscle. So a second group was told, as you see in the picture on the right, to hold the pen between their lips. Holding the pen between their lips, instead of contracting the zygomaticus major muscle, it contracts the, oh man, I don't know these muscle words, so I have to look them up. The orbicularis oris muscle. You don't have to memorize this. It's a facial muscle that contracts when you frown. So take a sec here, frown, right? Make a frowny face, see what happens with your eyebrows, see what happens with your lips. A third group was told to hold the pen as humankind originally intended in their hand, right? So that's all they had to do, is just hold the pen in their hand. While they were either holding the pen in their hand or their teeth or their lips, participants were shown a series of cartoons and asked to rate how funny they were. This should sound very familiar to you now. As the researchers anticipated, people who clenched the pen in between their teeth, right, the picture on the left, were most amused by cartoons. People who held the pen in their hand were moderately amused, and people who held the pen between their lips, making a fake frown, were the least amused. So based on this initial research and then just dozens, scores of studies that have come afterward, we have a lot of evidence that shows that the facial expression you're actually making influences your emotional state. There's also been more recent research looking at Botox, which I find super interesting. Botox, you probably are familiar with the idea. Botox is short for botulism toxin. So really what happens with Botox is you're injecting botulism into muscle groups. And what it does is it temporarily paralyzes the muscles that it's injected into or next to. So it's used a lot of the time to smooth wrinkles. So in one study, the idea of the Botox study, in one study, participants made an angry face when they're placed in an fMRI machine. You probably know fMRIs map changes in brain blood flow to see what areas of the brain are most active in various tasks. So the results of this particular study showed that before receiving Botox, if you frown and you're placed in the fMRI, it shows a lot of activity in your emotional brain regions, for instance, the amygdala. But if you then give the person Botox, stick them back in the fMRI, their brain activity actually decreases in those areas, even though they're looking at similarly, frown-inducing stimuli. In other words, having those frown muscles paralyzed actually makes you less frowny, like emotionally frowny. In another study, people who were injected with Botox in their frowning muscles actually took longer to read sentences that had angry and sad words than people who hadn't been injected with Botox. Right? So if I'm not able to frown, it actually takes me a little bit longer to understand the emotional content of something that I'm reading. Because if you've never noticed this, watch somebody who's like really deeply into a book that they're reading. You'll notice that when they get to happy parts, even if they're not like, ha 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 ha, like chuckling out loud, they probably have like a little bit of a smile on. And when they come to a scary part, they make a little bit of a scared face. When they come to a part that produces anger, they make a little bit of an angry face. And so it seems to be the case that making these sort of small facial expressions actually helps us understand and relate to what it is that we're reading. And when you're Botoxed, you kind of don't have that ability. Which begs the question, what happens emotionally to people who are Botoxed, like in the real world? Right, so this is just a picture I stole off of the internet. And it's the same woman, as you can see, and she got Botox in her upper lip and around her eyes. So this is this is big quotation marks, to correct a gummy smile. So you can see in the first picture, her smile naturally shows a lot of gum. And so if you, quote unquote, correct those muscles so that she has a less, high raising of the upper lip, it looks like the picture in the after, it looks like the after picture. But it raises this really interesting, perhaps even moral question. If a patient comes in and says, I hate my crow's feet that appear when I smile, can you please Botox them? Will that person actually be less happy as a result of Botoxing, right? Because they can't smile as big And I don't know about you, but when I look at these two pictures of this woman, she looks a lot happier in the first picture than in the second one, right? Imagine you are her significant other or her kid or her coworker or whatever, and you're like, "Oh, Susan, how are you?" And she shows this second smile. You're like, "Oh, not that great, huh?" Whereas if she shows you this first really genuine smile, it feels very different. It feels emotionally different. So, again, for this part of today's little lecture, we're talking about the physical and situational factors that cause emotions. And so, what I'm getting at here is your physical body influences your emotional reactions to things. But it's also the case that situational factors influence us. They influence our emotions, they influence our mood. And if you're curious about what the difference is between emotion and mood, read your textbook because it's in there. So there's a number of things that influence our mood situationally. Time of day actually is a really interesting one. Think to yourself, personally, privately, am I more of a morning person or more of a night person? Or am I sort of in the middle? Typically, there's, I don't know, 10-15% of the population who says I'm definitely a morning person, about the same percentage of people who say I'm definitely a night person, and then everybody else is kind of in the middle. I will also say that this changes with age. So if you are a night owl now, as a young adult, who knows, you might actually become more of a middle of the road person or even a morning person later on in life. So, excuse me, there's research that shows people's emotional states over the course of a day. What we have here, the little white dots, are people's negative affect. So sort of how grumpy am I feeling right now? And the squares are people's positive affect. How happy am I feeling right now? Now, here's the thing. Those are not the same variable. They're actually distinct variables, and they're often correlated, but researchers treat them differently because, as you can see, people's negative affect, if I point here, people's negative affect remains pretty similar throughout the entire day from 7 a.m. until midnight. But look at this line here for positive affect. You see that it's pretty low first thing in the morning, and then I guess the exception would be for really super morning people, but it tends to be fairly low in the morning. It goes up, it remains pretty high throughout most of the day, and then it starts to decline in the later evening. So if you want to think about how you can use this information, right, think about if I want to have a really great date, maybe I should consider having a date in the middle of the day or in the early evening instead of late in the evening when my mood starts to drop off pretty sharply. Another situational factor that influences mood is the day of the week. This has been, ever since we invented weekends, 150 years ago, this trend has started to show. It looks like this. So this is a similar graph to what you saw before. So here the sort of white diamonds are for negative affect, and the black circles are for positive affect. Along the bottom, we have the U.S. calendar for its Sunday first, Saturdays at the end of the week, and then the middle of the week is here. So what you see is that how much positive affect people feel. Well, surprisingly, Sunday's actually pretty low. But Mondays are not great. Tuesdays are a little better. Wednesdays, Thursdays, Friday, Saturday, yes! Like, people really do feel better on Friday and Saturday, right? Looking forward to and then being in the weekend. The thing that I think is surprising to a lot of people is that Sunday is so low. Part of that might be sort of the dread of Monday. So what this maybe means for us is that the dread of Monday is worse than Monday. You can also look at the negative affect, the white diamonds here, and see a similar pattern, right? That people really don't like Mondays. There's just a lot of negative affect on Mondays. But then throughout the rest of the week, your negative affect tends to drop so that by Friday and Saturday, you have pretty low negative affect. So yes, the day of the week that it is and the time of day both matter. Similarly, seasons matter. I don't have a graph for this one, but people's mood varies with seasons of the year. Now, you might have heard of a disorder called seasonal affective disorder. This is for people who experience extremely low mood in the winter, I should say in the northern hemisphere, whose mood is extremely low in the winter, there are questionnaires about this and things like that. But even people who don't have seasonal affective disorder seem to show a mild improvement in mood in spring and summer, and a little bit lower mood, especially in winter. The current weather, I love talking about this. So your mood varies with daily fluctuations in weather. So for instance, if it's a sunny day, people respond more positively to emotion and mood questionnaires. How good is your life overall? People will answer that more positively if it's a sunny day than if it's a cloudy day. Your whole life, like how good is your life, depends on if it's sunny? Yep, it does. There are also context effects. If it's been really cloudy and rainy the last several days, a clear day will suddenly feel much nicer than if it had been preceded by 3 or 4 clear days. A warm day is enjoyed more following a cold snap. A cool day is enjoyed more following a heat wave. So we really like contrast in ways that make the weather feel more pleasant to us. But here's one thing that I really love. I want to tell you briefly about a study that I really like. I told you that the weather influences people's just ratings of how happy their life is, period. The weather also influences other things, like our liking of a movie. So in one research study, researchers stood outside a movie theater and polled people as they left the movie. What movie did you watch? How much did you like it? What do you think influenced your liking of it? And what they found is that people who exit the movie theater and it's so bright and sunny, they said, oh, I really like the movie. And when they come out of the movie theater and they see that it's cloudy, they rate the same exact movie a little bit lower, which is just unfair and crazy and ridiculous, and who knows. You could imagine that this might correspond to many other evaluations, right? Maybe if you do teaching evaluations on a sunny day, you give much more positive evals, or if you're doing taste testing on a sunny day, you get better ratings, right? But the point is that, of course, this has nothing to do with the quality of the movie or the teaching or the food that you're taste testing. It's just one of these really subtle influences that we don't even recognize influences us. The last situational factor that I want to point out that influences our emotion is sleep. I'm probably not going to surprise too many people to say that sleep influences your mood. Let me show you the results of a research study from Talbot and colleagues, 2010, that looked at how much positive and negative affect people reported when they were rested, so that's sort of the darker yellow lines, versus when they were sleep deprived. When people were well rested, they felt really good. They reported feeling lots of positive affect and, moderate to low negative affect. When people were sleep deprived, it didn't influence their negative affect. Again, I said that negative affect needs to be measured separately from positive affect, and here's another example why. So it seems like being well rested doesn't make your negative affect any better, but it does decrease your positive affect. I don't know how I started that sentence. Being sleep deprived decreases your positive affect. So you're less happy if you're sleep deprived. You've probably experienced this, right? When you're sleep deprived, you're more likely to snap at people. You're more likely to, to take things too seriously. You're more likely to feel stressed and overwhelmed. But the thing that I think is really interesting is if you ask people about a variety, all of these situational factors, if you ask people how much did the fact that it's a Monday, or the fact that it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, or the season, or the weather, or how much sleep you got last night, how much do those things influence your emotions right now? People will tend to say very little. Now, people do have some insight into sleep, like we do recognize that sleep influences us, but the rest of these we don't even think about, but they do influence us. So we've finished talking about what is an emotion. We've finished talking about what causes emotion. Next time we're going to talk about the purpose of emotions and emotion regulation. So thank you very much for watching. I will see you later.